which is a chromosomal mutation, or it started from a chromosomal mutation that is passed on from generation to generation. So it started with a mutation, but it is always fatal. But it only occurs in later life. It's a gene that terminates with the sequence CAG, which produces valine, but this code skips and repeats CAG over and over and over again, and this is a dominant allele. So when you've got it, you are going to pass it on to your offspring. They're going to have it, and they will probably die from it. And there is a place in Venezuela around Lake Maracaibo, which has more than half of the villagers in a village around Lake Maracaibo have Huntington's chorea. Now, why would this be the case? Natural selection should just eliminate this, right? This is a fatal disease. Well, as it turns out, a single woman who lived 200 years ago had it, and because the effects don't materialize until after you're 40 years old, the alleles have already been passed on. That allele has already been passed on to the next generation. So either you don't reproduce at all, you choose not to do that, or you're going to pass on this always fatal disease to the next generation. And that's what's happened is this village has reproduced, and it has perpetuated this. So that's genetic drift. It explains a particularly weird case of the perpetuation of a fatal disease in a very small localized community. Now, what's kind of the opposite of genetic drift is what we call gene flow, and this is admixture. Now, we've been talking about speciation and how things move off in different directions, and genetic drift will cause those characteristics to drift off this way, and they'll lose these characteristics. But gene flow is sort of the opposite. It's admixture. It's coming back together. So this is where it works against speciation. And it's the reason why humans are only one species, that we're only one race, is because, let's face it, we're breeding with one another a lot. And there is no cutoff point. Okay, the Dunkers are an exception to that, where they've self-isolated, but by and large, we mix with one another across populations. And this is where, so gene flow or admixture counteracts speciation. And it's the fact that humans have been interbreeding with one another, which is the reason why we are the same race, why we're all the same species. If we were to get into a ship and isolate for long enough, we would speciate. But that would require us to not admix, to not have any more gene flow with one another. Once you start to mix together again, then that deme comes together and becomes the same gene pool again, right? So, although the closer geographically two populations are, the closer genetically they're going to be, it is a continuum. That there is no cutoff point that here is a race of people and here is another race of people. We are all mixing together, and I probably have the least in common, having my ancestry from Northern Europe. I have probably the least in common with people in North America genetically. But we've been mixing together with the exception of maybe the last 15,000 years with North Americans, that we're not different species. We can still come back together and have gene flow. And this graduated gradation of changes across the entire deme of the human population is what we call clines. So the characteristics that you see are clines, C-L-I-N-E-S, rather than, it's not the word for race. It just means that these characteristics fall off the further away from the concentration area you are. So you can think of the word as like incline, right? So it's an inclination towards being this particular group. In genetic terms, we call these haplogroups. And haplogroups are sort of the genetic component of what are clines. And it's one of the reasons why I think you should probably not put very much stock in any of these genetic tests if you ever get them from 23andMe or Ancestry.com, because they are deciding what the categories are based on their own opinions. And so they're drawing lines around things that have no lines. So they may say you are from this particular ancestry, but what's the difference between that ancestry and another? There is no stark line you can draw between them, which means that it's kind of a meaningless determination. Also, just a little bit of a coda to this whole chapter. We've been talking about natural selection, but we also have cultural selection too, that we can choose who we interbreed with. And so exogamous marriages, people that insist that you marry outside of your group and have interbreed with people that are outside of your immediate group, will have more genetic variation than those that are endogamous. You'll have less gene flow and less genetic variation. People like the Dunkers that choose to only isolate themselves. So these are exogamous and endogamous cultural groups will have different genetic concentrations. Also, the directionality. We have in cultural anthropology, we talk about patrilocality and matrilocality. That is to say, do you leave as a male, do you leave your household that you grew up in and go to your wife's house? That would be matrilocality. Or if you're a woman, do you leave your household and go into your husband's house, which is his father's house, and that sort of a thing? That's patrilocality. That will determine whether genes are going in one direction. So if it's a patrilocality, you're going to have female influence coming from different places, but the male line is going to be consistent. And the opposite will be true for matrilocality as well. So the directionality of gene flow is determined by our choices that we make. So I know this is a long chapter. I encourage you to go through and learn these terms and understand these four mechanisms. That's really an important thing. I'm stressing it again, so it's important. Natural selection, mutation, gene flow, genetic drift. Those are the four mechanisms, and they are the ways that evolution happens. All right, see you next time.